Alrighty, Father. So we just got done talking about God, and if you didn't see our previous episode, please take a look at that. But now it's really important for us to know the story.
Yeah.
And the creation story is full of everything. And it's awesome because, you see us starting out I'm going to go all the way to the beginning of God's creation.
Yeah.
Whole 7 days thing.
Yeah, the 7 days thing. We can see, like right now, if we look back to, 4,000 years ago, we can put ourselves in the Israelites' position. Let's just back up into Adam and Eve's position. People saw the world differently. People told the story differently than what we did now. They told the story of creation different than what we would right now because we know the sun is an object outside of the universe, outside of in the solar system, outside of the Earth.
Yeah.
That was not a concept that was fully understood. So it doesn't always, when I read Genesis, when I read the first couple of chapters of Genesis, I don't quite understand why these things that are maybe scientifically proven differently in our culture right now, why is it written in the way that it is?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question because the story of creation, if we're to kind of put it side by side with scientific theories about the creation of the universe, like, does it fit in? And I think it's really important out of the gates to recognize, like, there's no scientific theory about the formation of the universe that negates Genesis from being true. And in part, that's because Genesis is not trying to tell us a scientific story. The goal of the author of Genesis, inspired by the Holy Spirit, was not to give us the biological and scientific lowdown on how everything came to be. Rather, it's trying to get us an even more fundamental understanding of how and why things are, why the universe exists, the foundation of which makes science even possible. The foundation of which makes the world around us an even intelligible place. So I think it's important too, like we talk about the creation story in Genesis. It's like, I got to say, like, which one? Because there are two. And a lot of us don't even realize that in Genesis alone, you got chapter 1, which gives us one account of creation, which is more of like a narrative form. And that's where you get the 7 days of creation. And then you get Genesis 2, which is more of like, it's the same story, but told a bit more poetically. And even then, it's like, okay, well, which one of these is true? It's like, well, both. Both are true in the sense that they are trying to tell us true things about who God is, where we came from, and true things about what it means to be a human. And so I know we can kind of dive deeper into like what some of those things are. I think too, just the historical context around the writing down of the book of Genesis is important because these were oral stories that were passed down generation to generation among the Jewish people, the Israelite people, for ever, since they started telling these stories. But it was at a very definite time in the history of the Jewish people that they really put like pen to paper or whatever they were writing with and on back then to have us now have the ability to read these stories. And that took place during the Babylonian exile, when the Jews were taken out of the Holy Land, out of the land of Israel, and transported to Babylon, which is like modern-day Iraq. And there they were now no longer able to really practice their faith, especially their faith that was oriented towards the temple in Jerusalem, kind of stripped of a lot of the trappings of their faith. All they kind of came with were their stories that had been orally handed down to them. And now they're surrounded by a culture with a very different understanding of how we came to be, how our world came to be, and what the higher power, what the supreme being was. Specifically there in Babylon, they were surrounded by the Babylonian story of creation. It's called the Enuma Elish, and there's this great god for the Babylonians whose name was Marduk, and this Enuma Elish creation account, it's violent, it's messy, Humans do not come out of it looking like we're really all that great or important. This story of creation between this battle between competing gods, it's set in motion and in a completely different view of the world that then started to like come out in how the Babylonians lived their lives. So, for example, this kind of negative view of humanity that the Babylonian story of creation gives us was in part one of the reasons why the Babylonians' view of what marriage was got really off-kiltered and skewed. You know, how men and women would become married, the men would all go down to like basically an auction, and all the unmarried women would just be auctioned off to them. And it's like, where does that practice come from? Well, it's ultimately going to be rooted in your view of the world and what it means to be human, and what the most fundamental relationships of our human existence are. You can well imagine an Israelite in Babylon hearing these stories and kind of seeing how that shapes how people practice their lives and the worldviews they live by. Be like, gosh, this is not how we were living, and this isn't the story that we were told. And so what did they do? They started writing down their story of creation. Why? So they wouldn't forget. So that they could continue to transmit it from one generation to the next. This story that now we have in the book of Genesis, which, while not trying to be scientific, is incredibly beautiful and gets us to some really profound truths about who God is, who we are, and what the point of all of it is.
Yeah, I recently just heard something along the lines of God didn't need to show his love through sharing scientific evidence that would be discovered a couple thousand years later with Adam and Eve, or with the rest of the people who were going through the Babylonian exile. He didn't need to share those things, but rather we need to focus on the story itself. Yeah. And I think that's something I just love right there, is what, despite anything, like, we're not going to be saying anything about scientific anything. I'll just keep it there. We won't say anything about scientific evidence, but I think we have to just kind of take a 50,000-foot view of what is God trying to tell us about who we are. And that's something I super enjoy. And I think just kind of jumping straight into who we are, we can see Adam and Eve, our first parents.
Yeah. I mean, the story of creation begins just, hey, in the beginning, God created. And he creates how? Well, through this kind of mysterious thing to us, but through his spirit, which in Hebrew is ruach, which means breath, spirit, or life. And so God begins progressively filling up the void of everything. And in each day, as they pass, like, God is creating more complex things. You know, you start with night and day, and then you get to like vegetation, and then insects, and then bigger animals, and then boom, you get to day 6, and God creates humanity. You really see how this is kind of an upward trajectory of us being a very special part of what God has created. I know we'll talk about that later in a different video, but you know, it's kind of cool. Like, God takes the dirt of the ground there. And I always like sharing this. In Hebrew, that word for dirt or mud is also the same word for slime. And he forms like a man out of it. And then what does he do? He breathes his ruach, his spirit, into it. And the man becomes a living being. And so what are we? Yeah, we're kind of like stardust in this certain sense. Like, we're just a physical like product of the world, but we're also shot through with the very life of God, his spirit, the spirit through which he created everything. And this makes us made in his image and likeness, which is, just kind of the crown jewel of God's creation, and really the culminating point of the story of creation.
Yeah, and so kind of after that point, when Adam was first created, we're kind of moving into that second creation story that you were talking about earlier. There is Adam. and Adam needs a suitable partner.
Yeah.
And there is, the story goes the beautiful story goes as this. God came down and asked or told Adam, we need to find you somebody, basically. Let's do that. And so he shows him all these different birds, all these different animals, and Adam's like, no. This just is not it. And so what happens then is God comes and takes a bone from Adam's body to create a woman. And that is not from the foot, it is not from the head, but it is from the side. Yep. And that shows us that, well, a lot of things. It shows us how man and woman are equal, but also that we are here together. We are working and we are here to join, and we have our own unique abilities, but we all have our own mission.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you know, those words, I will make a helper suitable for him, that God speaks. I think in 2025, those for a lot of people are kind of, abrasive, kind of fighting words, but it's actually really beautiful when you look at the original Hebrew that Genesis was written in. One, like Eve wasn't an afterthought in the mind of God. God allows Adam to feel his need for someone else, that we're made in God's image, so we're made to be in relationship with one another. But in Hebrew, those words, helper suitable, or suitable partner, it's ezer kenegdo. And that word ezer, that we get the word helper from, it's not just someone to like, hey, around to make Adam sandwiches or anything like that. No, in the Old Testament, that word ezer is used several times, and almost every single time that word for helper is used, it's in reference to God, who is our helper. So far from being defamatory or derogatory towards who Eve is, it is, hey, here is someone that's going to be a helper in like a divine sort of way. But then that next word, kenegdo, you go back to some of the very first days of creation in Genesis 1. What's God doing? Well, he's creating like but different things. And so on day one, I'm going to create night and day. Night and day, they're like, but they're also different. And then, hey, I'm going to create land and sea. Well, land and sea, they're like things, but they're also different. But you think about those two things. Like when they come together, they form something much more beautiful than they were ever on their own. And so when maybe day and night meet, what do you get? Get a sunset. And, arguably, this is subjective, but like one of the most beautiful things, in the created world that we can take in. Well, how does it come about? It comes about by the joining of like but different things. Land and sea. Well, when land and sea meet, what do you get? Well, you get the beach, but you get the coastline. And there's something in a coastline that is far superior than if everything was just infinite ocean or infinite land, right? So what's the problem when it's just Adam? Well, he doesn't have this counterpart that makes something beautiful when they are joined together. And so Adam needs a like but different person that the joining of which makes not only the whole thing more promising and life fruitful through that relationship, but allows Adam and now Eve to be more fully who they are, because it makes them capable of loving. You might love your dog. I don't know if you have a dog, but you can't like truly love your dog. You have to have a person to be able to love. And that's the greatest capacity we have as humans.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I think that's a good further explanation as well. And I think it's good to note that things are really well right now.
Yeah, in this story,
yeah. In this story, things are good.
Yeah.
And God has given us a lot of freedom. God has given Adam and Eve a lot of freedom. I'm just going to kind of highlight and kind of go through some of the next parts of this story here, but definitely worth a read. But tell me a little bit about this. There is a tree.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve. Adam is asked to guard.
Yeah.
This garden that they're in.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that story?
Well, yeah. Adam and Eve, they're placed in paradise. They're placed in the Garden of Eden. And God has told them earlier, hey, I give you every seed-bearing plant for food. In other words, hey, I'm here to provide for all of your needs. But there is this one tree, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that you are not to eat of. And it's like, is this constrictive of God? No, it's this recognition that we are a part of God's creation. We aren't in charge of it. Like we don't own it. We've been entrusted with it. Like there are limits to our capabilities as humans. But God does, after giving Adam this command to shamar, to guard and protect the garden, like to involve him in this world that he's placed him in, he gives them a command in regards to all of these trees. Do you know, what was it that God commanded Adam and Eve?
Gosh. Was it something like, do not eat from...
No, not first at least. Because like, think about it. Like if God's first command, just think about what your image of God is. If the very first things that he told our ancestors, placed in the garden in the poetry of Genesis, was like, hey, you don't do something. Like what's your vision of God then? If the very first thing out of his mouth is, don't do this, what would your vision of God be?
Yeah, restrictive.
Yeah, restrictive, kind of a tyrant. C.S. Lewis once had asked a kid, hey, what's your image of God? And the kid was like, hey, God's the guy up in heaven who's looking down on earth to see if anybody's having any fun so that he can ruin it for them. It's like, no, that's a wrong image of who God is, but it's often the image of God that I think a lot of people are walking around with. And where does that come from? Well, in part, it comes from that first command, or as we kind of perceive that first command to be in the book of Genesis, that God told us, hey, don't eat of that tree. But when you actually look at, okay, what was that commandment of God? It wasn't this, hey, don't do something. It was a great permission on the part of God. Hey, you are free to eat of any of the trees in the garden, just not that one. So this paints a very different picture of who God is. That God isn't seeking to restrict us or like take away anything that makes life enjoyable or full. It gives us a picture of God as the one who wants us to have life and have it to the full, wants us to enjoy life, the God who provides, who is a generous father, ultimately. And in as much as Adam and Eve in the story remember that fact, have a proper understanding of who God is, then are they able to live in right relationship with him. And like you mentioned, like things go really well. But I mean, the wheels fall off after a couple verses. So, well, let's just talk about like how the wheels fall off.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. And Adam, as we just talked about, that shamar, to guard and protect, is supposed to protect him. He's supposed to protect his wife. Yeah. He's supposed to protect the land. Yeah. And we know that doesn't happen.
Right, and yeah, because hey, there's a serpent in God's good creation, right?
And we can see that in our own selves too. We know something went wrong. Yeah. We fail. So there is a story somewhere. Something had to have gone somewhere, and Genesis tells us the beginning of that story.
Yeah. And yeah, it's through this serpent, right? That makes its way up to Eve. And yeah, it's just interesting. And like what tools does the serpent have to kind of knock away and chip away at Eve's understanding of who God is and what God wants to do with her life? And how does the serpent do it? Well, he asks a question. And he asks a question that ultimately isn't a truthful question. Mm-hmm. Hey, he says, Eve, did God really tell you not to eat of any of the trees in the garden? And like right off the bat, we should be like, that's a twisting and a distortion of God's words.
You just said, you are freely able to eat of this. Yeah. And the deceiver is now twisting around what God is.
Exactly. And so we see the one thing that the enemy that we call, Satan or the devil wants to do. He wants to distort our vision of who God is. And he does that by like placing a seed of distrust in our minds that, hey, maybe God isn't for me. Maybe life without God would be better than life lived with God. And you see how this seed of distrust then leads to an act of disobedience because it gets to Eve. This distorted vision of who God is leads her to take from the tree that God did say, hey, you don't eat of that tree. And that really kind of leads to, hey, all hell breaking loose, right? There's this wedge now between Adam and Eve and God, and then we see how this wedge exists between Adam and Eve.
After the fruit is eaten of, then it kind of moves into there's a hiding of themselves. There's a shame that they hadn't had experienced.
Right. Yeah. We hear how they were both naked and unashamed. Like they could be fully known and loved by one another, but they could be fully known and loved by God. And sin does this. I mean, but shame is never something that God does. Shame never comes from God. It's the deceiver who not only twists our vision of God and tempts us into sin, but then is the same one who turns around and tries to get us to say, gosh, you're so stupid. How could you have done that? Why? Well, because as we see in Adam and Eve's story, that causes us to hide from God. Shame doesn't open us up to God, to his love and mercy. It causes us to hide. And this isn't where they find themselves. And sometimes we find ourselves in a similar place of like hiding from God because God, if he knew what I did, or because he knows what I've done, I can't stand to let him see me. But ultimately, they aren't left to live in that shame because, well, what does God do in it all?
And immediately, there is this line of, and correct me if I'm wrong with this, but it seemingly is blessing and curses that kind of come from this disobedience. And at one point, I think the best way to describe what was the case before eating of the fruit of the tree is this word harmony. All was good, and now there is chaos. And so we can see God immediately, yes, humanity has turned away. But from there, God had a plan of salvation already ready because he knew that this would happen. And that's what we call the proto-evangelium.
Yeah, the first gospel.
Yeah. And so if we kind of look more into the story, God says these blessings and these curses, but he also says there is someone yet to come.
Yeah.
There's someone who will take you out of this.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, so I mean, God comes searching. He says, "Where are you?" And this is really the beginning of all of what we call salvation history, the way in which God is seeking us out to bring us back into the relationship that we were created for. And how is he going to do that? Well, he's going to do it through this Son, ultimately, that he talks about already there in the Genesis 3, that's going to conquer the power that led to our kind of dismissal from the harmony of the Garden of Eden, the one who's going to heal and restore us and bring us back into right relationship with God. And we know that's Jesus Christ. But it's the entire story of the Bible that's leading up to his birth, and then ultimately what we call the Paschal mystery of his death and his resurrection. And so that question that God asks, "Where are you?" sets in motion the entire story of the Old Testament, where through some mountaintop experiences and through some deep valleys, the people of Israel are going to be the way and the means through which God is going to come and visit his people, the means by which God is going to come and dwell among us. And that's the gospel that comes to its culmination, its climax in the person of Jesus. But you already see the seed of it, the promise of it, on one of those very first pages of the Bible. So there's nothing random about anything. God saw and he planned for our salvation, which, that's another way of saying bringing us back into relationship with him. But we kind of see already in the story of Genesis how we were made for a relationship with God, that God is a generous Father who wants good things for us, that there's this reality of sin that often can take us out of that relationship, but that God is working and has worked to bring us back.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to end it. And I think, just being able to look at all of salvation history, there is a lot that happens from Genesis, the start of the Old Testament, from the start of the New Testament and the book of the Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, for sure.
And so if there are any questions about the promises that God makes to his people, how God saves his people, come to OCIA. We're going to talk about that. But we're going to have another video here shortly on the person of Jesus as well. So please be on the lookout for that as well. Yeah.